Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to After the Buzzer. I am your host, Couper Moorhead, and we are talking about the Miami Heat's loss to the number one team in the Eastern Conference, the Cleveland Cavaliers, who beat Miami 126 to 106. But it wasn't that bad for most of the game. It only got to 20 late. It just also didn't get inside of 10 very often. It was that kind of a game where Cleveland went up early, and they were really in control of the game because they were in control of the paint for most of the night. It was one of those games where Miami, they were playing uphill, and it's hard to play uphill all game. Every time they got close, Cleveland responded. Every time, they cut it to 10, 2 minutes later it was back to 16. Cut it to 11, 2 minutes later it's back to 18. Get it back to down to 8. Like 90 seconds later it's back up to 15. It was just that kind of a game. Donovan Mitchell, was the guy responding in a lot of those cases. He had 34 points on 23 shots. But, Cleveland, even though they were missing Darius Garland and some of their bench guys, they still found responses elsewhere. It didn't all have to be Mitchell, who only played 30 minutes. He had enough in the tank because he wasn't having to do too much throughout the game. He got to finish things off and play the closer, but, they got 20 points from Ty Jerome, 15 points from Georges Niang. They got plenty of bench scoring, and it was on a night where Cleveland wasn't getting a lot from three. So we are going to talk about the Cleveland's big lineup, Miami's big lineup, because that continues to be the story about how they're developing. And then we'll also talk about Terry Rozier, who had a pretty good game. But just a few more thoughts on this game. Even during an 8-3 third quarter where Miami scored 43 points, they only made up a handful of points because they weren't getting stops on the other end. Cleveland was making some threes when they needed to, some timely ones, but they would come down and get an offensive rebound put back. They would pass into a dunk, they would get a floater, or get to the free throw line. They were just finding ways to keep putting points on the board, even when Miami felt like they were making a run. But part of that problem was Miami was really only making runs when they were hitting threes. They weren't getting much in the paint. So even though Miami shot a little bit better, Cleveland outscored them in the paint 68 to 38. It's going to be a tough gap to make up when you're not having an elite shooting night, even though they had an elite shooting quarter in the third. So, the Cavaliers are a good team for a reason. They're number one in the East for a reason. They're going for a championship. That's the kind of season they're gearing up for. They're gearing up for a playoff run. They showed why. They could be missing guys, and people step up, step in, produce. That's what we were used to seeing from the Heat. You got to give the Cavaliers credit for having guys doing that and having a star player in Mitchell, along with Allen and Mobley, who just finished just about everything tonight. They did that, and they show why they're a great team this season. So, onto the front court. This is the ongoing story, starting Bam with Kel'el Ware. And, Spo asked about it after the game, like, do you look at Cleveland? Do you look at Jared Allen and Evan Mobley and see sort of the version of this working, down the line in that big lineup? He said that's a little bit of a reach, and later Terry Rozier said he does see some of that in them. Bam wasn't quite there. Everybody, their mileage varied on the comparison, but clearly Cleveland has something with two bigs that's working. For Miami, they just started doing this less than 2 weeks ago. We said last game that the Heat have needed threes lately, and that's part of because when the offense doesn't flow perfectly and they don't get that downhill ball in the air lob, or it's not pass, big to big, dunk or layup, when it doesn't go perfectly, they've had trouble finding those efficient two-point shots. Their two-point percentages have been down a little bit, even as they've been shooting the ball relatively well in the last 10 days or so. Tonight, Bam and Kel'el, when they were on the court, were a minus 13. The offensive rating was 105.1, even though they shot 50% from three, 7 of 14. And the defensive rating was a 145.9. You're going to have nights like that, and I think explaining it really well tonight was Bam. Let's throw it to what he had to say about the work in progress that is the Bam Kel'el big lineup.
Just getting great spacing. Obviously, like I said, it's a work in progress. It's been a small sample size, so we got to work through it. Everybody's gonna point to that because it's like, oh, that's the glaring, because that's supposed to be the fix. It's gonna be ups and downs to this. So, for us is really continue to stay confident, and it'll work.
And there, Bam repeated it again. It's the key phrase is work in progress, guys. There were times tonight where they're in each other's zones. Bam would catch the elbow, and Kalel had just been rolling there, so defenders were jumbled up. Spo mentioned in postgame there were a lot of bodies in the paint, and the offense wasn't flowing well enough to loosen up that grip on the paint. You have to not only hit shots, but your offense has to be flowing correctly. The spacing has to be correct to get the paint looser, and Miami just never did that. There was always a body in the paint. When they were getting downhill, when they were driving, Cleveland was like a team that's well drilled, that's used to playing with each other. They were switching off timely, switches, peeling off mid-drive sometimes. They were picking guys up when it wasn't their time, wasn't their man. They were all helping each other, and drives were really hard to finish, other than Terry Rozier, who we'll talk about in a minute. So, and then on the other end, obviously Miami gave up a lot of points in the paint, which is what you want to be limiting when you're playing big to big. So it just wasn't working as intended tonight. And, overall, we need to remind ourselves that as fun as and exciting as this new lineup is, it's not a silver bullet. It's not always going to work perfectly every night. It's not always going to close games out in dramatic fashion like they did in double overtime against the Magic the other night. There are going to be ups, like Bam said. There's going to be downs, and that's okay. That's part of trying new things, is that you can't expect them all to work all the time. Nothing is guaranteed. Sometimes it works out, like it has with Cleveland, playing big to big with Mobley and Allen, but even then, it's taken some time for them to really figure this out. And it's taken development, especially from the youngest guy in Mobley, who has added to his game, and Mobley gave him some credit. Even though Bam stifled him on a couple of late drives, he didn't show any fear. He went right into the paint. He tried to score on Bam. He tried to score on Ware. Allen, was playing physically. Those guys played with a confidence and a force of a big-to-big lineup that is working. And those guys, by the way, when they're on the floor together this season, it's a plus 13.2 net rating, which would be one of the best net ratings in the league for a team. Sometimes it doesn't work, too. I think we should look back at Indiana a few years ago at DeMontis Sabonis and Miles Turner. They tried that big lineup for a while, and they had some success with it, but it didn't really quite click. It didn't turn into a truly dynamic, lineup for them, and they eventually split that group up. So even the version of this working is going to take time for it to become, what it can be with at its absolute upside. And until you get there, you got to live with a little bit of this. That's fine. They're playing against a really talented team tonight, and the results weren't exactly what they've been over the course of the last 2 weeks. I think the thing we need to focus on right now is the defense will probably figure itself out. Even though zone wasn't working well tonight, it was just one of those nights. The offense is where I'm really keeping a close eye on. Spo has mentioned a bunch of times recently, the offense is going to come, but it's going to take some time. It's a work in progress. Again, he feels better about the defense than he does about the offense so far. And we need to heed those things when guys are saying that, because there's truth to it. They have to figure out their spacing. They have to figure out where they're going to find offense that isn't, the idealized threes, dunks, and layups. There's got to be stuff in between that gets you through games, and they've got to find it. So that's okay. Again, development, trying new things. So last thing was Terry Rozier. Aside from Cleveland's own poor shooting, and if they had shot better, this probably wouldn't have been as close as it was. Such as it was, it wasn't all that close. And though there were times where Miami was in it, and Miami was in it, they were attached for stretches because Rozier was the guy who could get in the paint. He was the guy getting downhill. He finished perfect 6 of 6 in the paint. He scored 22 points on 13 shots. He had, he wasn't quite getting layups, but he was finishing those long touch kind of floater / layups, short floaters, long layups, whatever you want to call those. He can finish those. He can make tough shots, and he was going at, the big guys in the paint and finishing over them, and he kept Miami attached. He made a couple runs almost on his own. It didn't really amount to much overall, which was through no fault of Terry's at all, but it's a reminder, of the player that he can be. The talent offensively is still there, even though this has been, a bit of a rough offensive season for him. He's still got that first step. He's still got that smooth, herky-jerky, handle that can trip up a defender into defending nothing at all. When it goes right, he can leave people in the dust, and he also has the tough shot making the step backs. They haven't fallen for him, at the rate that he's set, his career standard for, similar to Bam. In Bam's comfort zones, he hasn't met his career standards. And usually when I see that, assuming guys are healthy, I think they'll eventually, water will find its level because guys have set a certain standard on those kinds of shots in those zones. You would think it's going to come for Terry. What's been difficult is there's been so much lineup shifting, and for him there's been role shifting. That's probably been a little difficult for him to find his footing, especially now that they're trying out these lineups with brand new spacing. So it was good to see him be able to get downhill with these new lineups and find some success there on a night where most of the other guys, aside from, Bam had a good scoring night, an efficient night, but everybody else kind of had a rough time because the spacing was so off. It's good to see Terry find some success there because it's not easy adjusting and then adjusting and then adjusting again over the course of a season, especially when you don't start the season well. Again, we'll give him some grace there. Good to see him have a good offensive night on what was otherwise not the best night for the Heat, but if you're going to have not your best night, it's more understandable when it comes against one of the best teams in the league, if not, the best team based on record. So tough night against Cleveland after a really fun win the other night against Orlando, and now the team goes out for a 4-game trip. We'll see how that goes. We'll still stay on top of, these new lineup developments and how all this goes from here because, again, there's going to be ups, there's going to be downs, but it's fun, unique, and it's interesting, and that's why we're talking about it. So thank you for joining us on After the Buzzer. I'm your host, Couper Moorhead, and I will see you next time. For now, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you.